Hello and welcome to the Talent Equals podcast. I'm your host, William Laitinen, and in today's episode, we're talking all about distributed working. Now, before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, distributed working was the norm only for a privileged few. And this is despite the existence of technologies that would support those digital nomads. They would support you or me working from anywhere in the world in a highly productive and integrated fashion. But most people were still forced to live near or commute to the office each week. This idea of presenteeism, of showing up at your desk each week, regardless of its actual functional necessity, was still heavily pervasive in our working culture. But the pandemic has changed that. As companies have been forced to radically rethink their working practices, many office workers have been granted a new level of autonomy almost overnight. And the leaders in organizations used to present employees have had to adapt, have had to find new ways of working. Jezen Thomas is with me today, and he is the CTO of Supercede. Now, you may recognize the name Supercede because in a previous episode we had the other co-founders, Ben Rose and Jared Lee, talking about what Supercede is trying to do in reinventing the reinsurance ecosystem. But now I want to turn to their work practices, the way that Supercede has leveraged a distributed workforce to compete for talent, to compete at doing the very thing that all of their competitors are doing in fixed locations. We're going to talk about the principles that enable effective distributed working and the challenges of having a distributed workforce, and then how Supercede manages and cares for those remote employees, and Jezen's own journey into the role of CTO at Supercede. Jezen is another very thoughtful co-founder, proving to me why I think Supercede really should be one to look out for. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And without further ado, I give you Jezen Thomas. Jezen, welcome to Talent Equals. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, Jezen, you're one of the other co-founders of Supercede, and I had your colleagues Ben and Jared on the show recently, and you've been kind enough to join us as the CTO and talk about maybe a slightly different topic to what you're doing at Supercede. But before we sort of dive into the detail, I sort of thought your story, your journey into technology is very relevant, I think. And so I think maybe could you just share like how you got into tech and becoming a CTO?
I think it came down to necessity. I was originally a professional musician, and that was my life passion back in my teens. I played the drums in a rock band and traveled around Europe and the Middle East playing shows. But unfortunately, the arts are drastically underfunded, to put it lightly. And it gets tiring not being able to afford rent or to feed yourself. And by the time I was 20, I think I was, 21, 21 maybe. I was not homeless, but having to stand on the street in Holborn in London every day and eat with all the homeless people. Thanks to Harry Krishna, who kindly feed people who don't have food. And not having any resources like that is pretty tough. So I tried to make a change in my life. And computing is something I've always just done. I loved computer games as a child. I loved sort of making or modifying games. So it was a natural path into just tinkering with things more generally. And then I would build a website for myself. For example, when I was teaching music privately, I needed some way to market that service. So that's the skill I had, which I shopped out to some agencies in Sweden, where I moved to when I was 18. I was sort of back and forth between the UK and Sweden. And fortunately enough, one web development agency in Gothenburg in Sweden were kind enough to give me a chance. And I wasn't really good enough to have a job at the time, but I think I killed them with enthusiasm. And they didn't have the heart to not keep me on for longer than my initial 2-week trial. So I worked there for 7 months, and that was my foot in the door to the industry. And then I gradually did a sort of land and expand approach with my skills. I constantly tried to get better at different programming languages and different approaches to things, become more broadly knowledged, and eventually ended up building my own products in their entirety, and then marketed them myself and sold them to people, got customers, and made some money by myself. And then I realized that while I can do the sales and marketing and sort of business side of this job, it's not really something I wake up in the morning and I'm passionate about. So I realized that if I want to become a success of anything, I'm going to have to find some smart people to partner with who can do that salesy side. And that's how I eventually found Ben and Jared a few years ago.
Wow. I feel like there's many points upon that storyline I want to touch on. So excuse me if we backtrack a few steps there.
Sure, let's do it.
Let's do it. Right. So you were playing rock and roll in the Middle East. Why the Middle East, first of all? What?
Well, okay. I played in a rock band in Sweden mostly, but in the Middle East I did other stuff. So I think it's any professional musician's responsibility to be very diverse and to play anything. So I was a drummer, but I could play a little bit of piano, and I still can sight read music. And I did a lot of jazz theory and a lot of harmony classes. I went to the weekend school in the Sage, Gateshead, in the north of England. I got a scholarship to go and study there when I was 16. So music was a very serious thing for me. But in the Middle East, I was actually part of a street theater company, and we would walk on 2-meter high stilts and play sort of marching drums while dressed as a giant animal. It could be a bird, it could be a robot, it could be an ant, or we had a bunch of different costumes. And I did this in the Middle East a couple of times, and in Italy and Belgium and Portugal, a bunch of places. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So you were really like doing the whole traveling troupe thing. That was the musician performer was taken to the nth degree. Now, how old were you when you were doing that?
I was 16 when I started traveling with that theater company. So I remember one of my first international performances was I had to skip school essentially to go and do this thing, which I think is not allowed in the UK. But my
not
friends
many places.
were at school.
Yeah.
My friends were at school, and I was sort of lying down in the back of an old Sprinter van, going from Newcastle down to Dover, and then across into we played in Ostend in Belgium. We played for their Halloween parade, which was really funny actually, because the local council of Ostend turned off all the street lights, and I was wearing a mask as well. This sort of big, I think it was an ant themed head. And in that part of Belgium, probably other parts as well, the drains in the street, the gutters, are this modern design. It's like a flat metal plate. But because this is the end of October, it's cold and it's slippery. And I slipped on the drain, and I very nearly almost fell over, which when you're on 2-meter high stilts, that's a long way down.
It's a long way down.
It hurts a bit when you fall. I did fall one time in Salamanca in Spain. I ended up in the newspaper for that. It was very funny because once you fall over, you can't get back up. And I was dressed as a giant butterfly. And this is the last show of the tour that week in Salamanca. And I had gone for a much longer walk than I was than I had done previously. And the children in this parade were a bit more confident and were trying to sort of pull me down out of my costume. I tripped and I fell a long way. I sort of came out of the costume with a bit of a bleeding nose. I was surrounded by people who were terrified. And I had to walk back to the van through the city in a sort of skin-tight catsuit, because that's all you wear under the costume.
Wow. So you were living something of a precarious life, both metaphorically and also practically there, by walking on stilts and being a performing artist all over Europe. Like,
yeah, it was an adventure. Yeah.
Yeah, but adventurous, right? I wonder, like, see, that was all sort of was that sort of self-led? Do you want to just go and do that? Was that sort of just a learning that you wanted to follow and you just followed it? What was the thing that you sort of, what motivated you by that? And what are the values you think you've reflect on now based on those experiences?
I think it's just a part of my personality that I have a bit of tunnel vision. I like few things, but the things that I like, I tend to focus on to the detriment of everything else. That's for better or for worse, I suppose. So I was very much into skateboarding and snowboarding as a kid, and that's all I ever wanted to do. And the music was the same. And I think it was extreme sports, music, and computers. And I've ended up falling back to the one that provides you with an income.
Well, that I feel like there was a stage there. So from your music and your performing, and then you talked about that moment of realization. Well, you were homeless and you were living on the edge, I suppose, with charity of others. You talked about Hare Krishnas there, and it's at that moment then you reflected that you needed to do something different, and that's where the move towards computing came. But at the heart of that,
I wasn't homeless.
you weren't homeless?
No, but I was eating with the homeless every day.
You were eating with the homeless, okay?
Because
well, fair enough.
I had no money to pay for food.
Okay.
I was living in a council flat in London, so I wasn't that hard done by, but it wasn't nice. But to try and find a silver lining in that, it gave me a really good opportunity to question my philosophical standpoint in life. I've always been an atheist, or at least agnostic, but it was devout people who were feeding the homeless, and still are, I suppose. So it made me question how strongly I should challenge conventional religions, if at all. Thinking more deeply about it, do organized religions have a monopoly on compassion? Probably not, but there was something to learn, definitely, for me.
Well, I certainly hear in that a type of humility from being where you are, and also a recognition of compassion and kindness. And when others show that to you, it's much easier to remember that and to then foster that and into the way that you approach the world.
Definitely, yeah.
And it's always incredibly humbling when others show you kindness when you have nothing to give in any other way. It's simply just a thank you, and that's I think a very pure form of compassion to show. So I'm very interested to hear that sort of, but that kind of brings to me like also your motivation, and I'm interested there because you self-taught, you went to Sweden and you kind of turned up as that plucky young man at I think you said like a web development agency, and they gave you the work, right? Or a development company, they gave you the opportunity. So when you reflect on that, they weren't hiring you for your competencies, they were hiring you for your values, right? And that seems to be a very interesting thing to consider, right? This idea that they were looking for someone who kind of they could identify with. But up to that point, how do you reflect on that? I mean, that motivation, that need is what got you where you wanted to go. But you weren't going through, computer science education. You weren't going through the big universities at this point, right? You've literally focused on teaching yourself these skills?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are multiple paths to get to more or less the same goal. Not that I would discount a traditional computer science education.
Mm.
I think I would like to have had some of that more formal training, and some of my colleagues at Supercede have that formal training, and it's hugely beneficial to us. So I definitely value that, but it's not the only way, and it's not the way that I went for various reasons.
Well, I think this sort of feeds into maybe the next question I want to ask you, really, which is, what does distributed working mean to you?
So I stipulated from the beginning of the company that we're going to be a distributed team. And this is partly for my own selfish reasons. I don't want to be bound to an expensive hub like London. But it's also, I think, a very good bit of leverage for the business, because we now have access to talent all over the world. And we can compete with much larger and much wealthier companies on different bases. So I think a lot of my colleagues could go and work at Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, these companies if they wanted to, and they would earn a lot more money for doing that. But work has to be more than just about money, really. So one of the ways that we compete is, well, the people that we tend to attract, I think they like to sit at home, do the work that they enjoy, but also be able to sit in their garden and take care of their cats, and not have to deal with getting up in the morning and cramming themselves onto the tube.
So it started with a selfish desire, you said. And what is that selfish desire for you to be distributed?
I've always traveled, and I'm traveling currently. So I have a car and some stuff, mostly clothes and a computer. And I spend roughly a month in, I travel to a different country sort of every month. I've just arrived now in Ukraine. Previous month I was in Bulgaria, and before that I was in Turkey. And I wouldn't want to miss out on that cultural experience. I really love being able to interact with different people and see the way that different people live, and different cultural values and customs and that sort of thing, which is actually really beneficial to my role. I mean, it's kind of tautological now. I like interacting with different cultures and becoming more worldly, which makes me better suited to managing a team that is more worldly, because I can empathize a little bit better, I think, with people of very different backgrounds, which is one of the challenges of having a distributed team. I know that some companies, when they say distributed, they mean, oh, you can be anywhere in the US, or you must be in the UK, or you must be in Europe somewhat. In our case, we have people all over the world, which brings a number of challenges, but I think for us, it's a net benefit. This has actually been great for us during the pandemic. And one of my colleagues normally lives in the Netherlands, but he decided to go and live in the Caribbean in his family house, I think originally just for a month, but then ended up staying there, I think, for 6 months. I mean, the reasoning being, it's nice in the Caribbean. Everything's locked down in the Netherlands. What's the point in going back? And indeed, what is the point? I really appreciate that minimalist philosophy of living more deliberately and choosing the kind of life that you want, rather than it being sort of dictated to you by that constraint of having to live where your office is.
So is that like, so in terms of distributed for you, then you use the word minimalist and deliberate. it kind of thinks of, it kind of brings to mind this idea of authenticity. You know, I hear in this that you can just be much more authentic to like what you want to do and who you want to be and where you want to be. And it's within the distributed model, you're saying the where in which you work is fine. I don't mind as long as the output is such that we get the quality that we need, right? So is that what you think about it? Also, do you resonate with this idea of authenticity to distributed working? And that it ends up kind of blurring less with this idea of, you know, the work and the private life. How have you thought about that?
Yeah, I've never liked the idea of, and not to be crass, but I think it's often referred to as butts in seats. I don't think that's what a healthy office looks like. Just, you know, ensuring people are sitting in their chair for 8 hours. I think that's nonsensical. And I've worked in offices before where it was, I think, a point of pride for the company that people spent so much time in the office. But actually, a lot of the time spent in the office was on Facebook, playing PlayStation, drinking. There was quite a lot of alcohol in the office. And as far as meaningful work, not much happened. I think the company eventually kind of tanked. But I don't want to have that kind of company. I think it's a bit of a trope, and I think it's a bit of a pathetic one that so many companies try and attract people with juvenile novelties, like, oh, but we have, you know, drinking nights and we have a foosball table. And I think for a lot of people, well, at least the people that I work with, they don't care. They have lives, they have their loved ones, they have the things that they care about. They want to be able to do their job comfortably and maintain their sanity and then go home.
Yeah, I find that interesting because certainly what I think about is that you end up creating a tribe of like-minded people to which the model that we're talking about serves. I think it's that there's like an inevitable flexibility which I appreciate, but there are deep-seated cultural beliefs about going to the office which are still happening right now and they're still trying to be overcome. And I think we only have to see recent letter from Tim Cook to the Apple employees talking about needing to return to the office at least 3 days a week. And I find that model from a company that is creating, you know, tech that's supposed to be mobile, almost, you know, so counterintuitive. It's so feels so rooted in a different time and a different way of working, given what we've just been through in a pandemic, that it almost just detracts from this idea of freedom and authenticity. It's, you know, it's a prescription of you must be in a place to produce work. It feels in a way to me like a type of commitment to a servitude or even a lack of trust that things can be done in a certain way. And I think that's maybe where but I do understand that working in a distributed way can feel very alien to a lot of people. And I think a lot is very misunderstood. So I suppose you guys have been doing this before the pandemic. So my question was one, well, you've already talked about that you could attract people that may otherwise be able to go to Apple or to such. So it's obviously an advantage. But I suppose my question to you is, what principles do you feel enable really effective distributed working?
Good writing and patience. And that dramatic pause wasn't intentional, but it was neat.
Good writing, very much underrated.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain that for us, please?
A lot of what our company does is discovery and invention. It's a science and an art, and there is a lot of context and nuance that has to be expressed in all of the ideas that people on the team come up with. I think writing that vividly, comprehensively, it ends up being much quicker than explaining the same thing badly a number of times to everyone on the team. And for each time there to be some misunderstanding. So that's also why I say patience, because it often feels like it's quicker just to jump on a call with someone and have a chat about a thing, get a status update, or can you move this button to the left a bit, something. And I think that impatience actually leads to chaos. It leads to people not knowing what they should be working on, not knowing what the strategy is, and people wasting time working on the wrong thing. And I think that's one thing we really care about at Supercede is just being calm. We can let our competitors panic and fumble over themselves, and we'll be calm and we'll iterate and we'll get it done. We'll do it right, and it's going to be great. And that's worked for us really nicely so far.
Do you help train that, or do you interview for that? Is that what you sort of over interview for, or how do you? Because you've got lots of cultures as well, so you've got people in all over different parts of the world. So presuming some of those maybe are not native English speakers. So how do you manage that?
Yes, it's difficult, as you said. It's deceptive, and it's quite tough. And that's just where experience plays into it. There's an art and a science to it. There's no quick, easy fix to find the good writers. In the same way that there's no quick and easy fix to determining people's productivity in the team. And I find myself in these discussions a lot around how do you measure a developer's output? How do you know that people are doing their job? Can you track the number of bugs they fix, or the number of cards they move in your project tracker, or number of pull requests, or lines of code written, or some such metric? And basically all of those are nonsensical, in the same way that, asking a doctor or a scientist for an estimate on when they're going to cure cancer is nonsensical. So many of these questions are piece of string, how long is a piece of string type questions. And we do try and attract people who communicate well. Well, that's what we're looking for when we're hiring people. Not exclusively, but that plays heavily into it, to varying degrees as well. Of course, our writing standards are not going to be the same if, between someone who is a native English speaker and someone who isn't. But I think there is quite a big difference between command of a language like English and how you communicate and express yourself. I think somebody can communicate their ideas very, very clearly, even without speaking their native language. And I think it's more to do with defining the essentials of an idea and removing all the rest. I think actually this is probably more applicable, probably equally as applicable, but I find it quite applicable to business people. And the business people in our team are all they're all native English speakers. But there is a culture in the corporate world of speaking in this kind of secret language and saying lots of words that don't actually mean anything. I remember the first fintech company I worked at, it was my bosses were from sort of McKinsey and from some banks. They're extremely corporate guys. And I would always tease them for it, that they would say to me, "Oh, great, Jezen. So we'll reach out and touch base." Is what they would say. And I say, "You mean you'll call me and we'll talk?"
Well, I'm guilty of saying reaching out and touching base. So yeah. Well, that's interesting because as I mentioned, first of all, I'm guilty as charged on using those types of flowery language, being a Britishman, and yes, maybe liking the sound of my own voice too much. But there is something to be said about simplicity. Maybe it was Winston Churchill said, I had to write you the long version because I didn't have time to write you the short version. And it is so much easier just to write stuff down. And it's hard to be brief and to be meaningfully brief and contain a lot, because it does take a lot of effort and thought. And so I hear in that you guys are asynchronous in a lot of the work that you do if you're working across time zones. So if you've got different people in different places, and that's the reason that you have to have this strong written form of communication, because a lot of the way that you're working isn't going to be synchronized. Is that correct?
It's part of it. It's definitely the ambition. I think it also just scales better because, as I said, I don't think you save any time by not writing things down. I think even just the process of writing things out, there's this idea in software development called rubber ducking, where perhaps you're struggling with a problem, some engineering problem, some algorithm, and you can't quite get your head around it. And so what often happens is you ask for help. You ask somebody else for help. And just in the process of describing the problem to somebody else, that triggers something in your brain to see the solution. So with rubber ducking, it would be that you have, let's say, a rubber duck, a bath duck on your desk. And when you get stuck, you just explain the problem to the rubber duck. And in that process of forcing yourself to clarify the constraints of your problem, you begin to see the solution. You begin to see the essentials of the idea. Writing does the same thing, absolutely. I think a lot of people find this when they're trying to get their sort of philosophical ideas out in their blog. They'll really consolidate an idea. They'll learn more about their own thinking process just by writing things down. So that's valuable in and of itself. But then also, it's much easier for everybody else in the team and all the people who are yet to join the team, but will at some point, who still need this information. It's easier for them to consume the information if it's written down. And again, it seems so simple that it wouldn't have much value, but actually it's one of the most powerful things that we do.
I like that, rubber ducking. I had it strikes me of journaling, I suppose, and as well, and the power of just getting your thoughts down on paper. I must say I've approached it somewhat differently. I've got a slightly adjacent example, but I coach under sevens football, under eights now, and to coach under eights football to young kids, you first of all have to explain all of the basics that you take, for example, for granted. And in designing some training programs, I actually was working with my colleague Samantha, who has no experience of football, and I had to explain the training session to her. And when I explained it to her, she asked me a really good question, which was, "What is a throw-in?" And I was like, "Oh, I hadn't actually explained what a throw-in was." And then she said, "Well, how do you get a corner?" And I hadn't even explained how you get a corner in football, and how all these very simple foundational principles, which I had taken for granted in my own experience, were so fundamental to the actual lesson itself. In explaining to somebody else, it really brought home what I was missing. So I can see it in another way, but maybe I need to get myself a rubber duck on the desk as well for some of my thinking.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, on I think it's called expert blindness. And of course, in the industry that Supercede is operating in, it's full of very smart people. It's full of experts, but it's the sort of smarter you are, and the more knowledge you have on a topic, the easier it is to forget what it is to not know things, and to not have the context that you have. I think that's a very common thing. So it's definitely worth writing things down for that reason too.
So we've got, like, with distributed working, that you can live a more flexible lifestyle. You can be where you want to be. It opens Supercede up to a much greater talent pool of people who will maybe take a different path, very talented, but maybe want to have a different lifestyle. So that opens up that talent pool to you. Talked about this idea of it helps you think in a much more succinct way, because the importance of writing your ideas down and developing some of these values of patience. So that's all great stuff. But what's the bad stuff? Because I'm sure there's got to be some drawbacks to this model, and if so, what are those?
Well, it's certainly not for everyone, as I said. I think I think you expressed it well earlier when you said that our team sort of self-selects for the behaviors that suit us. But one of the challenges we still have are that different cultural backgrounds are indeed very, very different. And that's a reality for us, especially because tone doesn't communicate well across text, or it's extremely difficult to express tone through text.
That's what emojis were invented for, right?
Yeah.
But seriously,
yes, and I mean we've talked about this internally a fair bit, that even though it seems silly, they do help. I mean, the challenge, of course, is I think a lot of people don't want to feel infantilized, which excessive emoji use, it can feel that way. We're still grown-ups who want to do a good, serious job. We're doing serious work. So I think something that everybody has had to learn and continue learning are methods of sort of, de-escalation, conflict resolution. And also, I wouldn't say it's over communicating, but doing the extra work of providing the added context when communicating things, which includes explaining what you're not saying when you say something. So, for example, if I'm critiquing a colleague's piece of work, I would say, I'm not sure about X, but that isn't to say I mean Y, for example.
Yeah. It's interesting. So the need to, the over communication that you talked about is prevalent when we're faced with feedback scenarios, right? So I can see how that must be difficult, particularly for dealing with cultures where, let's say, British culture versus maybe Eastern European. I've seen some definite differences within being very direct in some of the the Eastern European culture. Brutally so, almost the time. The Dutch are pretty famous for this, but also in the other parts of Eastern Europe. And then you could sort of kind of counter that with someone like in the UK, where sometimes it's best, a lot of talking around the problem and the reason and the situation.
And we have people in the UK. We have people in an American, one American, two Americans, and we have a number of Slavs, myself included. I'm half Polish. And we have people in Russia, in Ukraine, and we have someone from the Netherlands. And those, I wouldn't say problems, but these phenomena have absolutely manifested themselves in the team. And it's something we have to put a lot of work into mitigating.
Well, I think one of the things I often hear about distributed working is that, hey, well, what about the human element, right? You miss all of that human interaction and that human connection. And I want to get into this because I read one of your articles, and I'm going to ask you this way: why do you love Monday mornings?
Good segue. So
yeah,
we have a tradition at Supercede, which I actually stole from my last job, but I thought it was a very good idea for a number of reasons. We have a tradition of beginning our only weekly synchronous team meeting, which is on a Monday, with everyone on the team being given the express opportunity to say thank you to someone on the team for something specific that happened, usually in the past week. And there is some nuance to this process. The sort of rules, we don't always keep to them, but mostly this guideline is that it must be somebody specific. You can't just say, I want to thank everyone because you're all great, because that seems really disingenuous. And we try and keep it apolitical as well, which is, it's hard. This is one of these sort of soft skill things that's hard to put strict bounds on. But the point of the exercise is to bring people closer together and to for people to realize that the hard work that they put in has not gone unnoticed by others, which I think reinforces that behavior. I think we're quite lucky on the team that people often go the extra mile and they put on the gloves and do the work, even when it's not so glamorous, which is really what you need on a team. And the unglamorous work is often left unsung. And then if no one cares about the hard work you're doing, why would you bother to keep doing it? So it's important for people to know that their work is being noticed. And it's also a really good opportunity for everybody in the team to have a chance to speak. It's not really fun if it's just the bosses of the team speaking all the time, and then some maybe more junior developer, perhaps who doesn't even have English as a first language, is sort of in silence most of the time. That's not really fun for them. I think also tying back with the living and working deliberately idea that we talked about earlier, I think it's a good opportunity for people to think about the work they want to be doing and where they want to be in life. So if it's been a number of weeks, and this is not something we track and enforce, of course, but if it were me sitting on a team and every Monday I just think, you know what, I have no one to thank, I don't care, that would be good feedback just for myself to think, do I really want to be on this team? I mean, sure, it's a paycheck and then the work's okay, but at least in this industry, the people who work in this industry are generally privileged enough to have other places to go if they want to, and that they have that choice. Sadly, not everyone has that choice to work on what they want to, but in this industry, I think most people do. So if you can't find anything to be happy about on a team, then perhaps you better find something in life that makes you happy.
It's a powerful tool. One, in that you're giving a sense of community to each other. You're giving everyone an opportunity to have voice and feel heard. And they need to take deliberate action. They've got to have clear perception also of what's going on. And then you said it gives you this opportunity to say, well, am I in the right place? And self-selecting again, give them a sense of ownership over being in the community or not. It all comes from saying thank you to someone, a type of gratitude, kindness.
Yeah, it seemed, I think, a little bit silly and novel when we first introduced it, but it quickly became like, no, this is great. I really enjoy this. And everyone really, I mean, perhaps not absolutely everyone, but for the most part, everybody enjoys it. I would say though that we are very careful to make sure we don't start tracking these things, and that people don't feel like they need to keep up appearances. People need to feel safe when they say, yeah, I don't have anything to say, I'll pass for this week. Because if you create a sort of office politics culture through this kind of process, then it's really counterproductive.
So, Jezen, that brings to mind like this idea that if someone is struggling, and through the pandemic, many people were struggling with their sort of mental health and well-being, and as a manager where you're not seeing them walking through the office, or you're not maybe seeing that they, they maybe had to take a moment on their own. How do you deal with those when you get an intuition or you need to help somebody out in your team? How do you handle that sort of that caring side of things as a manager?
With most of the team, at least the engineering team, I have a weekly one-on-one session, which is expressly not a status update on their work, and it's mostly an opportunity for them to have my ear for 30 to 45 minutes or an hour. And the structure of these meetings varies wildly. There's no rigid structure. And sometimes it's feedback, professional feedback. Sometimes it's a sort of open brainstorming session on how to do something or approach some problem. Sometimes it's just it's introspection together, and sometimes it's just a very casual, how's it going? Like let's sit and drink coffee and just chat about our adventures and what's going on. Which is, I think it's important to have these regularly. And it was one of the important principles from the beginning of the company that although we are a distributed team, we're not outsourcing. It's not, external people that work on this. We are still a team. We don't get to see each other, every day, but we are still a team of people who care about each other, which is challenging when we aren't co-located. But it just means you have to have a more deliberate effort that goes into that. So the one-on-one meetings is one way to do it. We also have, I host most afternoons a coffee chat meeting. So it's not obligatory. It's just an open sort of channel. I'm going to sit and drink coffee, and I can share some stories. If people want to join, everyone can share stories and drink coffee, just chat. This is another idea that I stole from my work in Sweden, because it's a bit of a cultural tradition there as well.
I think being able to feel a sense of trust in an individual requires that you feel that they actually are interested in your whole self, and trust is the basis of community. And so I personally hear in what you're saying to me that the deliberate action is what is important. The deliberate action of caring, of actually wanting to listen and hear what the other person is feeling. That is the most important thing, not whether or not you're sitting next to them or across a desk from them in the same office or meeting them at a coffee machine, because you can be physically present but emotionally distant if in an in-person interaction. It really is important is to get that properly deep interest in the other person and what they're going through. And that, I feel anyway can melt away the disconnect. And my own experience of this, I've been headhunting. I live in Devon. I've always lived remotely from the markets I serve. I've headhunted in France, Germany, Switzerland, US, Scandinavia, and I've always done it over the phone or like this. And my unifying experience has been that I can develop meaningful relationships with people when I actually am interested in a meaningful relationship with them, and that the medium is actually not as important. I mean, there is much to be had at just a phone call. There's much to be had with just video or just in typing and having a written communication. As is in person, they all offer something different, but they do not equal a better version of something. They are just a different tool within that medium of a true and authentic interaction with someone. So I think that's what I would be pushing people through to. And I hear in what you're saying, to just care, truly care about the personal interaction with the other. And from there will come the trust, and then develop the community. I suppose now let's talk a bit about you hiring. And this is a big theme for me, and value-based hiring is a topic that I'm very much focused on as a headhunter. And what I mean by value-based headhunting is that I focus primarily on the values of the individual and the motivations of the individual as one of the primary things on which I'm actually assessing. And competencies, while of course remain a sort of a hygiene factor dependent upon the needs of the position, I ultimately focus on, for the best fit for long-term relationships, I focus on values. And I suppose this is kind of where I'd like to sort of just ask you about that, because many times I've heard it said, unfortunately, in the more technical disciplines like computer engineering, I've heard CTO say it to me before. Look, I don't care about their personality. just tell me that they can code, and then we'll get them going. And maybe that's a cliche that people have of a computer engineer. It's somebody who sits in a dark room. You just sort of, you poke a requirement at them every now and again, close the door quick and let them get on with it, because, you don't want to interact with, these highly technical people. But I wonder what you think about this idea of focusing on values and motivations, and as well as competencies, or as a preference over like fixed competencies at this stage. Do you have any thoughts on that as a CTO?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think a lot of the discussion in this space it tends to be at one end of the extreme or the other, which I don't agree with at all. I know that it's a common idea, as you say, for someone to not care about an engineer's personality. They can be a horrible person, but the important thing is that they crank out amazing code all the time. I don't agree with that. I also don't agree with the idea that, well, technology is the easy part. What's really hard is the soft skills. Technology is not easy either, and characterizing that way doesn't actually help anybody. One of the great thinkers in this space, Camille Fournier, I think, described that idea as hallmark pablum, which I really appreciate. And it is, I think, counterproductive to say that the only hard thing in computer science is dealing with people. It has to be both. So there's no point having someone on your team who's, they're nice all the time, but they don't actually get anything done. People need to be able to ship, and that's a value that we hire for quite deliberately. So typically when someone is in the pipeline to join the team, to join the engineering team, we do not a lot of technical testing up front, sort of technical pre-screening. We do is we talk to them and see what kind of person they are and how effectively and deliberately they communicate. Usually we can determine by the work they've already done in their career where their technical competence is. That's usually not the problem. And when it comes to things like knowledge of certain kinds of algorithms, those can be looked up when they're needed. But what you can't determine by somebody's CV or their GitHub repositories is their determination to ship things and their ability to focus on a task and get things done. So actually we bring people on in almost all cases for a week. So a trial week, which is paid. We don't agree with the idea of giving people a big task for them to prove themselves, which takes several hours and they don't get any money for it. That's not fair. So we pay people, I think, quite fairly for their trial week. And in almost all cases, it's been, here's the general direction we want you to go down, but you figure it out. At least where the company is at currently, the types of people that we're hiring for are so-called managers of one. So for the most part, they can determine their own direction. They can pick what is valuable to work on, and they can find a way to solve the given problem in a variety of capacities. So they'll be able to find the cheap solution. They'll be able to find the comprehensive solution. We have this idea on the team of building the skateboard before we build the Ferrari. So if we have some product idea or some feature, we're not going to try and make all the disjoint pieces in isolation and then construct them together for a big bang release where it's going to be amazing at the end. We try and just make the absolute simplest version of some idea, which is, like a skateboard. And then, it could be better if it had some handlebars. You just add that bit. Now it's a scooter, but it still does the same thing. It still gets you around. I think there are a couple of illustrations online which express this idea, but it's something we try and adhere to quite a lot on the team.
So I hear in that then that you do value the way in which people get stuff done, but of course the ability to get the technical competency, of course, is important. And you're testing that by giving them this trial week, which seems like a great way to do it. Give them a trial week to try something out, see how good they are, and that will evidence whether or not they actually got the competency. And while you're doing the interviewing, you're also assessing the sort of the personality qualities. Can they also fit within the team and the culture of the organization? And do you find that works even with like hard to win talent? Because I suppose you're competing with people who may be already in jobs they want. So, you say, look, come and do a trial week, but, you might not, get the job at the end of it. How does that work when somebody's already in a job and you need them to move?
That has happened a number of times. Sometimes we can, have a shorter week, but in most cases, people have just taken leave from their job and they'll say, oh, I'm going on holiday for a week or some such story. But I think Supercede doesn't need to be an amazing place to work. I think it just needs to be a comfortable, calm, reasonable place to work. I think actually the standard is very low. What we're up against in terms of us competing for people's attention on the market, I think the status quo is kind of terrible.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that people are tired of having to do synchronous daily stand-ups where they have this really monotonous routine of, yesterday I worked on this, today I will work on this, I do not have any blockers. It's just like such a waste of time. And this is seen in the industry as some kind of best practice. Often when you join a company, the questions will be like, so do you do 1 week sprints or 2 week sprints? How does your Scrum meetings work? And it's just taken as a universal truth that you have to do these little religious processes. And if you say to someone, actually, we don't do that. We think a bit more clearly about what we're doing. We mostly leave you alone to do your best work. That's enough motivation for people to think, wow, I should check this out. It's different. It's something new. I'm going to go do that. It's worked for us so far.
And for an investor listening to you here to saying that, that might be investing in Supercede or thinking about it, does that also mean that you don't have to pay talent quite as much, or you can secure them more affordably? What does it mean? What's one of the other advantages of that different style?
Oh, yeah, I was sort of thinking about this question popping up earlier, and I'm wondering how to put it tactfully. Yes, we can pay people less than if we were especially if we were based in Silicon Valley, for example. And the reason I'm conscious of being tactful now is because I've had it in the past where people say, you need to hire graduates in Silicon Valley because you pay for what you get. And I think it's bullshit. And not only is it bullshit, it's racist bullshit. Because there is this very common sentiment that, if you want things to work, you need to get smart people in America. Or if you're cheap, you can farm the work out to Ukraine or India or Russia. Mm-hmm. But it's just nonsense that the idea is, that the talent in any of those other countries is not up to par. Personally, I think that's it's the same reason why the West was a bit, incredulous at the Soviets winning the space race. I mean, there are lots of smart people all around the world, and they don't all cost $200,000 a year.
Yeah, I understand why it's a difficult question to ask, because one would say, "Oh, well, are we being cheap?" But I think it's more to an idea of for the person who you're hiring, the flexibility of lifestyle is more important than another 50 grand on the paycheck.
Absolutely.
That's certainly what I think, that when you find people, my personal experience as being a headhunter, that money as a motivating factor is probably about number 3 or number 4 down on the list of what truly drives outstanding people. I've never had what I consider to be an A-class talent focus on money. Of course, the money comes as a result of their excellence, but usually they're shooting at like delivering impactful work or living in a meaningful way, working with people that they truly respect. That is the thing that they're aiming at, because there's a recognition otherwise that, well, money just doesn't bring you happiness. It brings comfort and some satisfaction and some flexibility and freedom, but it certainly does not generate sort of the meaningful experiences. So yeah, I know it can feel like a bit of and I agree to your point as well about, the quality of work. I think I heard it said, maybe by Naval Ravikant, that never has there been a greater opportunity to learn, but a greater deficit of motivation to learn. And so it's so true that, if you are a plucky musician who's been traveling around Europe, who decides that they want to learn how to develop, computer engineering skills, as long as you're motivated to go out and do that, there is such a plethora of opportunity that does not have to be a traditional route. Of course, go the computer science way, as we say, but motivation is probably at the heart of it, the attribute, the value that needs to be nurtured and fostered in all of this. Yeah. So, okay, well, finishing up, a question I always like to end up with, though, is some books. So like your top 3 books, or some books that really influenced you or love. That can be self-help, technical, sci-fi. I don't care what they are, but I suppose books that you think have come and influenced your life and you like to maybe readily share with others. Do you have any that you would recommend?
Yes. I think the book that immediately comes to mind is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. That gave me a lot of perspective into what a religion is, what a belief system is. Having the idea of different economic systems and even just currency that we use, understanding that those are belief systems as well with different mechanics, is a really powerful idea. I really enjoyed that. And it gave me a lot of insight into the history of humanity. The following 2 books in that series, Homo Deus and I think 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, also good, but the highlight for me was the first one, Sapiens. I also really like Randal Munroe as an author. He is famous for a webcomic series called XKCD. It's very popular among engineers.
XKCD? I've not heard of this one.
Definitely check it out. Probably you've seen some of the illustrations, the monochrome stick figure comic strips.
Okay, yes.
And very math and engineering focused. And his book called What If is a very enjoyable read. And it's a scientist's answer to ridiculous questions. For example, how high would you need to drop a raw beefsteak for it to cook itself on its re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere? And he performs all the mathematical calculations to figure that out and tries to describe what you would be left with at the end. It's very, very funny and very insightful.
Is it possible to get to medium? That's my question. Yeah, that would be that.
No, as I recall, basically whatever you try, it's going to be charred on the outside and raw on the inside.
Well, some people like it like that, so that's that sounds great. That sounds creative nerdiness. I like that. Okay, cool. Randal Munroe. And anything else as your final?
As a third book, I really enjoyed Bad Science by Ben Goldacre. I believe it was called Bad Science. And he investigates all the pseudoscience and the failings the medical industry to better inform people and to run meaningful experiments. I'm very much into the quack medicine topic. I think it's fascinating that so many people globally can be defrauded by witch doctors and homeopaths. That seems to affect a lot of people that I care about. So I care a lot about this topic, and I'm always interested to hear how bad ideas, conspiracy theories, anti-vaccine people, sort of how these ideas spread, and how to convince someone of an idea when facts don't mean anything. That's fascinating to me, because my worldview, as far as I of course there's bias that plays into this, but I believe my worldview is predominantly fact-based as best as I can. So it's fascinating to me when somebody will look at some data and completely discard it because it doesn't agree with their narrative. Whereas my understanding of science and just the quest for knowledge generally is the work of finding counterexamples that disprove ideas, which then brings you closer to the truth. I think Bad Science is a really good book for that.
Fascinating. What an interesting topic in and around sort of the viral nature of bad ideas. It is a theme that's something I've thought about a lot, actually, and how we convince others and how we are convinced, and the emotional triggers that are sort of universal to humans. This is an interesting theme of many philosophers, and also I think the antidote to that is actually good philosophy, in fact, and trying to cultivate a sense of clear perspective, and that helps you to weed out the bad ideas. And I think that's something that certainly has been proliferated through antiquity from the best philosophies. I can think of Stoicism for that, certainly, in their drive continually for seeing things clearly for what they are, so we can weed out those bad ideas. So that's one for me to check out for sure. And I'm going to try a new question I have on you, Jezen, if I may.
All right.
Who is a thinker that you really admire that you don't think other people know much about?
Peter Hitchens. Sadly, the late Peter Hitchens passed away with cancer a few years ago. He is the creator of technology called Zero MQ, and he wrote a number of very interesting books. My favorite being Culture and Empire, somewhat on the same topic as Sapiens. And Zero MQ is a rather sort of famously well-functioning open source community. I think his perspective, and she documents very nicely, is a radical way of thinking about how to get people with very different motivations and very different backgrounds to work together productively. And some of those ideas filter through into Supercede's work as well. So I think, I'm not sure we take a contrarian point to the rest of the industry, but we definitely do things slightly differently from a lot of other companies. For example, most of the time when somebody submits a unit of work, we ship it pretty much immediately. And we shy away from this gatekeeping attitude that a lot of companies have, where a unit of work must first go through militant inspection before we'll accept it. And his approach was very different from that. And that's worked really well for us.
Peter Hitchens, Zero MQ, use Culture and Empire. That's one to check out. Thank you very much. You said you answered it incredibly quickly, which was a good sign. And I think there are so many wonderful thinkers out there who are often undiscovered. And I'll say, to one of the books you mentioned, Sapiens, there is a great counterbook that I first read before Sapiens, which is by a guy called Andrew Marr. It's a sort of relatively well-known BBC presenter. Maybe you know him. I think he wrote a book called A History of the World. I get that right as well. And it's I think actually a better version of Sapiens. And I would thoroughly recommend that if you're also interested in Sapiens. He's a historian and as well as a BBC Met. And so, that's it's a much unknown version or kind of a similar topic. So if you're interested in that, that's one to have.
Absolutely. Thank you for the recommendation.
But brilliant. Well, Jezen, I'd like to say thank you so much for all your time and spending time talking about what you guys are doing at Supercede. Having spoken to you, to Ben, to Jared, I'm continually impressed by how thoughtful you are and how deliberate you are in what you're doing, in the way that you're approaching tackling this massive issue of reimagining an reinsurance ecosystem. And but you've shared with me, I think, a very important topic around the importance of creating a distributed working model and a culture which can support that. So thank you for your time. Thank you for everything. And I wish you and the whole team much success at Supercede.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.